All right. So the next section we're going to talk about the religious right, and we're going to talk about Christianity. And I'm a strong advocate that I believe everyone should have the right to worship however they want to. Um, this isn't an anti-Christian section. I do believe majority of Christians are wonderful people, but and at the same time, we need to also understand that Christianity, the role that Christianity has played in our past, and not only giving the moral authority, but also encouraging some very oppressive systems from colonialism to slavery, to Jim Crow and lynching. And then it's important for us to understand these things because also this is still happening today. Christianity is still being used as a powerful tool to force systems of patriarchy and white supremacy and neoliberal capitalism, and we need to like I said, we need to I'm not asking people, I'm not advocating that we turn our backs to Christianity. We need continue loving Christianity, but at the same time be able to critically look at how it's being used to push powerful systems of oppression. And we're going to have front row seats over the next decade, because depending on when I don't know when people are watching this presentation, but it's being recorded as the Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, and it's looking very likely that Trump and Mitch McConnell are going to replace her with an ultra Christian conservative judge, which if that happens, that means we're going to watch over the next decade or so many of our human rights, from our reproductive rights, the rights to healthcare, immigration rights, labor rights. We're going to watch a lot of our rights dismantled. In the name of Christian conservatism. So it's important, we need to be able to embrace Christianity and at the same time be able to critically look at it. So this is what this next section is going to be about. We're going to kind of look at the history and how it's kind of helped shape and molded a lot of policies and systems throughout our history, and continues to do so, particularly with what we call the religious right. So this is a great quote by Gandhi. Just a heads up, if you're going to use this quote, there's been some that claim that he didn't actually say this. This is more a paraphrase, but if you read a lot of what he's written about Christianity, even if it's paraphrased, this is very similar to what he thought, and then which makes sense because he grew up in colonial British Empire, where in India, where the British, the Christian nation of Britain, was dominated his country and pushed all kinds of oppressive policies, oftentimes in the name of Christianity. So it makes sense for him to say this, but definitely just heads up. People may argue that if he actually said these exact words or not. All right, so I'm going to, I want to start off just talking about what is the religious right. So this is the religious right. We're going to get more into the history of the religious right and later in this section. But religious right is basically this ultra-conservative Christian, political coalition that was formed in the late late 70s, early 80s, particularly around Reagan. Before him, a lot of people, people in the Christian right wouldn't have, weren't that political, but were kind of rallied and organized around certain, issues to kind of support the Republican Party, and it continues to do so to this day. And they mainly rally around trying to push, socially conservative policies, looking to, elect, socially conservative, judges, politicians, and most importantly, judges. As I was mentioning, Ruth Bader Ginsburg just passed away, and there's a lot, big part of religious right is pushing politicians like Trump and Mitch McConnell to replace progressive judges, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's done, has a lifetime fighting for women's rights and fighting for a lot of different rights. There is a little bit critical. There is, particularly around anti-Black, anti-Indigenous. She wasn't perfect, so I'm not going to paint her as this perfect person. But at the same time, she fought really hard for to kind of open up human rights in this country, and it's looking like we're going to replace her with their new pick, Amy Coney Barrett, who has a long history of fighting to dismantle human rights and civil rights, and it's looking to overturn a lot of policies. Elizabeth Warren hit it on the nose when she talked about some of the big ones that are looking to be dismantled. Roe versus Wade. A week after the election this fall, the Supreme Court's going to overhear, kind of review the legality of Obamacare or Affordable Care Act, and she's promised, Amy Coney Barrett's promised to overturn, Obamacare, throwing, millions off of insurance, healthcare insurance. We're looking at, climate change, dreamers, voting, all different kinds of things, right to a union. It's looking like this is going to happen, and it's going to be pretty destructive for a while. So this is a major, what we would consider a major victory for religious right, but also a chance for us to kind of understand the real impact of the religious right, and how this is not just like a personal belief or religion. This is a politically active group that's pushing, conservative, ultra conservative policies, looking to dismantle human rights for many people. So when we look at religious right, it's mainly what we call white evangelical Protestants. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into what evangelical means, but that's the bulk of it. Most of them, living in the South, but there are, evangelicals all over the country. But there's a big, concentration called the Bible Belt in the South. But there's also a large minority of Roman Catholics, and then there's also some mainland Protestants, Jews, and Mormons as well in this religious right. So the typical issues is they push this, this is a big, dog whistle, family values. They push this idea of family values, which also often means, patriarchal, society, having, the woman stay at home, in subservient roles, having school prayer, teaching kind of a whitewashed American history that, downplays, slavery, that, sells this myth that we were founded on as a Christian nation when we were actually founded on a secular nation with specific constitution mentioning that the separation of church and state. But these are things that they push for, and then there's a lot of things they're against. Again, they're against the separation of church and state, so that they work with a lot of politicians to kind of remove that barrier. They think that politicians and religions should be working together to create our laws. And they're really against LGBTQ rights. They're against women's rights, reproductive rights, contraceptive, abortion, sex education, gun control, stem cell research, pornography, evolution, and particularly after 9/11, they've been against Islam. There's been an enormous amount of Islamophobia being taught from a lot of preachers, and a lot of leaders, from Jerry Falwell Jr. to several other ones that we'll talk about. And there's a lot of coalition groups, a Moral Majority, Christian Coalition focused on family, and there's a lot of these groups in this coalition has actually been designated by the Southern Poverty Law Center as actual hate groups as well, like Alliance Defending Freedom, Americans Promise Ministry, American Family Associations. So a lot of times they're mainly designated for their for pushing policies that's looking to basically to take away rights and protections against LGBTQ people or women's rights or things like that. So that's oftentimes why they're designated as hate groups, is because they're looking to actually push policies that are just take away protections from gay people, from trans people, from women, and a lot of times they push a lot of Islamophobia as well. So that's why several of them are designated as hate groups. So when we talk about evangelicals, so what do we mean by evangelicals? And that's a tough question, because it's a big umbrella term. It's not necessarily it encompasses a lot of denominations, a lot of churches, a lot of organizations as well. But what we do know about evangelicals is it's about a quarter of the U.S. population, so it's a very large group of people, and it's also about a quarter of our voting population. And the majority of them, end up voting. If you look at some of the data from Pew Center, majority of them, vote for the Republican Party. And the majority of them, again, they live all over the country, but there's a large concentration, what we call the Bible Belt, in kind of the southern, states. And we're going to talk about why that is and the history behind that as well later in this section. But they can be Baptists, Pentecostals, Methodists, prosperity gospel, which we'll talk more about, which is this Protestant belief that based on giving money to a church and then getting that, giving money to God, and then God will give you prosperity. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But I like this quote from Jonathan Merritt. He says, individual observers are left to decide how to define what makes someone or something evangelical. To the pollster, it's a sociological term. To a pastor, is a denominational or doctrinal term. And to the politician, is a synonym for white Christian Republican. So that's, mainly, I would say it's a lot of Protestants, Baptists, Pentecostals, things like that. But how we're going to look at it mainly through this political term. Oftentimes evangelicals are white Christian Republicans. So that's again, there's a lot of exceptions to that, but for the most part, if you're a white Christian Republican, you probably identify as a bit evangelical. And some of the common beliefs that evangelicals will hold are that common belief in Jesus is the savior of humanity, and they have this belief that they need to convert people. So that's, I think, the big difference between evangelicals is it's not just a personal belief. It's something that has to be pushed onto a society, that they have to convert as much of society as possible in order to save everyone. And then this historian Bevington in 1989, he was working on this history of religion, chronicles, and things like that. And he defined evangelicals by 4 traits. And a lot of people have really referred to this as pretty accurate for most part. Again, there's lots of exceptions. But, a high regard for the Bible, focus on Jesus' crucifixion and its saving effects. Belief that humans need to be converted, and a belief that faith should influence one's public life. So that faith should, so all public life, whether you're, wherever you work, particularly politicians and things like that, they should be, the moral, it should be influenced on what decisions they make should be influenced by their faith. So they really, pose this idea of separation of church and state. And then so when you take a step back and you kind of wonder, Trump did very well with evangelicals, even during the primaries. And you look at, Trump, someone that's had 3 wives, multiple affairs, he's constant unchristian behavior, open racist, lack of biblical knowledge. He's not the typical person that you would think would be a religious leader, or a candidate that a religious organization would rally around. Yet at the same time, he won an enormous amount of support. And a lot of people say, well, you see a lot of like evangelical, leaders, I've seen several of them in interviews. They talk about, Trump is, bad and we don't support all this stuff, but he's pushing our agenda. He's pushing conservative judges, he's pushing, anti-abortion rhetoric, he's pushing and, Islamophobia rhetoric and policies, so, I can see that, that does, that doesn't make sense. We'll ignore Trump's personal life as long as he's delivering on public policies. But that doesn't really answer the question is why did they pick him in the primary? And to be honest, not every white evangelical was supportive of Trump. His evangelical support. It wasn't the majority, but I mean, it wasn't like, everyone didn't all evangelicals didn't rally around Trump, but at the same time, he did win into the primaries the majority of evangelical voters, and that's and if you look at some of the candidates, like Ted Cruz, who's an actual white evangelical, who is definitely believes this stuff much more than Trump. And he did get some support, but not enough. Trump won the majority of white evangelicals in the primary. So it makes you wonder, if this is just about getting judges and pushing policies, why didn't they go with someone like Ted Cruz, or go with Mark Rubio, or someone that's less not Christian, less offensive. So there is something else to it. It's not just about policies and judges. And that's something that we're going to explore a little bit through the history of white evangelicals in this country. But once Trump did win the nomination, he got the majority of the evangelical vote. So even yeah. And then when we start looking at, there's been a lot of studies lately about views around white evangelicals, and we start seeing, a pattern with a lot of these. It's not just about, saving people and pushing the Bible. There's some common, racial views among majority of white evangelicals. And there was this, 2008 American Values Survey by Public Religion Research Institute that surveyed, thousands of adults, across a bunch of different issues. But what they found when they were talking about the race issues, is they found that white evangelicals typically supported more racist views than other groups. For example, they're the only religious group, out of all the religious groups surveyed that believe that U.S. becoming a majority of minorities, or white people becoming a minority in 2045 was a negative thing. They're the only group that favored preventing, refugees from entering, having laws preventing refugees from entering the U.S. So if you look at the survey, this is actually that question. Majority of the country prevents, views that we shouldn't have laws preventing refugees. We should be open to refugees, and the majority of evangelicals actually believe we should have laws, preventing refugees from coming into our country. The only religious group that saying that with a majority that says immigrants threaten U.S. customs and values and way of life. It displayed the strongest support for a travel ban against Muslim countries. They're most likely to say killing of black men by police are isolated instances. They're least likely to think Trump's words and actions encourage white supremacist groups, and they're actually the only religious group that believes that the Catholic churches actually did a good job handling the sexual harassment and sex abuse scandals that resulted in thousands of kids being abused over decades. So one common thing that we see is they don't they oppose things like it oppose well, let me just read this. So there's another book, there's a book that comes out by Robert Jones, who looked at the last couple of decades of surveys much like this, and actually wrote a book called The White Too Long: Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, and found that white evangelicals oftentimes displayed the most racist views, and oftentimes denied things like systemic racism more than any other group. But when we read this article, this quote about his book, deeply racist attitudes have become embedded in the DNA of white Christian identity over time, and calls for an honest reckoning with a complicated, painful, and even shameful past. White Christian churches as cultural institutions have legitimized the dominance of white supremacy. White Christians have not just been complacent or complicit, rather, as the nation's dominant cultural power, it has constructed and sustained a project of perpetuating white supremacy that has framed the entire American story. The legacy of this unholy union still lives in the DNA of white Christianity today, and not just among white evangelical Protestants in the South, but also among white mainland Protestants in the Midwest and white Catholics in the Northeast. Pointing to this, more than 2 decades of experience studying religious Americans nationwide throughout public opinion polls, Robert P. Jones said his research shows white Christians are more likely than other whites to, for example, deny the existence of structural racism. Through the use of a racism index, Jones also demonstrated that white Christians scored higher than their secular counterparts, regardless of whether they were evangelical, Southern, Mainland Protestant, or Catholic, even after applying controls to the research, like eliminating people who are Christian in the name only. So we're going to kind of dive deeper into, why this is, why there's so much data right now that's kind of showing that particularly white evangelicals, but oftentimes, a lot of, white Christians in general, oftentimes hold more racist views. And so we're going to dive a little bit into the history and kind of how all this, started. So to really understand, to get some common roots of what, how a lot of this started, we need to go back to pre-colonial history of Christianity. We need to go back to this concept called the purity of blood. And this really developed in Spain around the 1400s. So a lot was happening in Spain at this time. They were reconquesting. It was called the Spanish Reconquista. They're this Christian, nation was basically reconquering Spain. Particularly the southern Spain, where a lot of Moors or Moorish or Islam people or Muslims and Jewish people lived in the south. So they reconquered everything, and then they decided that the monarch at the time wanted Spain to be a Christian nation. So they basically gave everyone a choice, convert to Christianity or leave, and they expelled hundreds of thousands of Jewish and Muslims at this time, and then thousands of Jews and Muslims actually stayed and converted to Christianity so that they could stay and with their families and their homes. But at the same time, you saw this idea that, yes, they were converting, but there was still a lot of discrimination against Jews and Muslims. So that cultivated into this idea of purity of blood, like this idea that basically basically Jews and Muslims were even if they converted to Christians, weren't the same Christians as the old school Christians, the European Christians. They actually divided people into old Christians and new Christians, and recent converts were Jews and Muslims, but they still believed that these people were inferior, and they came up with this concept that their biological concept that it was actually their blood that caused an inferiority. This is basically kind of setting the roots for this new idea that would blow up during European colonialism of races. They basically racialized Jews and Muslims, saying even if they converted to Christianity, their blood was still tainted. So they weren't fully Christians at the time, and so they created all these laws, basically being discriminatory laws against Jews and Muslims, while creating all these privileges for European white Christians. And this became really dire during the Spanish Inquisition, which was basically started to kind of root out, all these new people converted to Christianity, Jews and Muslims, but there was just still a lot of this, racism at the time that these people were so inferior and they were faking it. So they had all these inquisitions to kind of root out, the heretics, the false Christians. And in reality, if you read, this is a really great book about this time period, Dogs of God. It talks about reality. A lot of this was the fact that the Christian monarch at the time needed a lot of money to continue things like crusades, and they looked towards the Jews and Muslims, because when they would arrest them and put them through these inquisitions, and they had to prove that they were Christian, at the same time they would confiscate all their property and all their money, and then use that to continue waging war against Islam and during the crusades. So a lot of it was about getting money, but at the same time it created this idea that if you weren't this pure Christian, that if you're Jewish and Muslim, even if you converted to Christians, you were still an inferior race. And this idea of blood purity really helped, create a lot of a lot of racist concepts throughout the time through the creation of the black race in the 1400s by the Portugal, during the transatlantic slave system. They created, the idea of black people to kind of justify enslaving them and killing them for profit, by saying that they're this inferior race, and they you were actually bringing civilization and helping them out. At the same time, the white race was created in Virginia and in colonial times to kind of create legal privileges for white people, while enhancing discrimination against black people. And then we see all these other things like the one drop rule, where if you just had any kind of heritage, any kind of relative that was black, in your genealogy, you couldn't be considered white because you had tainted blood. Same with native blood quantum. They used that to judge if Native Americans were really Native Americans or not. Spain had a whole colonial caste system, based on how European you were versus how much your blood you were mixed with indigenous and black people. And this, that colonial caste system is still, you can still see that, today throughout, Latin America. And then the biggest one we'll talk a lot more about was the idea that white Christianity, that white supremacy was embodied in white womanhood. And that was, the thing that you had to protect white women against these savage black people. And we saw this, happen during slavery, and particularly after slavery with the rise of Jim Crow and segregation and lynching and things like that. So all of this stuff kind of came from this concept of purity of blood, that that if you have any lineage, any genealogy that wasn't, completely white and completely European, that you had, and you had tainted blood, and this idea that not only was it, created a racial hierarchy, but also created a need to protect the racial hierarchy through violence and through all kinds of horrific things. I want to read this quote by Paul Keeble. He writes, "Throughout the Europe, not just isolated in Spain, the Inquisition became a popular phenomenon orchestrated and enforced by religious authority and state powers, and with widespread public participation. Crowds of thousands would turn out for hangings, burnings, beheadings, and various forms of torture, much as crowds of white Christians turn out for lynchings in the US centuries later. Many times mobs would apprehend people accused of heresy and murder them on the spot, sometimes destroying entire communities of Jews. This theory of blood impurity, racial inferiority, was subsequently used to justify the inferiority treatment, murder, and enslavement of Africans, indigenous peoples, and the Western Hemisphere. For example, after Bacon's rebellion, when Virginia decreed in 1667 that converted slaves could be kept in bondage because they had heathen ancestry, the justification for black servitude changed from religious status to a racialized one." And then I want to take a second to kind of explore how, the rise of European colonialism, how Christianity not only gave it the moral authority for that, but also helped encourage colonialism and slavery and domination of indigenous cultures throughout the world. And they mainly did this through what's called the Catholic doctrine. So it's a series of doctrines in the 1400s, the biggest one being the doctrine of discovery at the end of 1493, that basically said that any Christian nation could go and dominate, exploit, kill, enslave any non-Christian and non-European, or which was basically non-white, but they didn't have the word white. They didn't describe people as white back then, but basically non-European nation. So he gave him permission to basically, quotation marks, discover these lands and then conquer them and exploit them, make lots of money, off of killing them and enslaving people, stealing their land. But they could do all this stuff as long as they brought Christianity with them. So as long as they were able to, they justified all these things by saying, we're bringing Christianity, we're bringing civilization to these indigenous savages throughout the world. And we talk about this like it happened a long time ago, but this is still, particularly the doctrine of discovery, is still a legal precedent that keeps us from giving back land to Native Americans that we stole. We've used that in the Supreme Court case, and several Supreme Court cases have used that to deny Natives right to their land up until 2005. We're talking about, some of the more critical parts of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and a lot of people, she actually used this precedent, I believe it was like 2005 to help, deny the right of native land. So this is still something that's been used, throughout throughout our history. um, and so and at the same time, Thomas Jefferson used this to, as a legal, what gave him legal justification to expand westward and actually start dominate the western indigenous land. So this is still something that's still with us today. I want to read this, another Paul Keeble book quote. He wrote, "A series of papal bulls declared that Christian nations were free in law and by divine approval to lay claim to what were called unoccupied lands, terra nullius, or lands belonging to so-called heathens or pagans. Slavery was divinely sanctioned in these statements. Again, the intertwined economic and religious motivations is clear. Slavery would be an economic benefit to the colonizers, but this was justified by the responsibility to convert and thereby civilize the enslaved people." And at the same time, Christianity was also used, during colonialism to help pacify any kind of colonial resistance. We see this in particularly with like Africa, where they would teach, these lessons. To accept the laws of the land, and to follow your, slave masters or enslavers. And then if you did all of that, you'd be rewarded with, going to heaven in the afterlife. So I'm going to read this from Walter Rodney, who wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. "The church's role was primarily to preserve the social relations of colonialism as an extension of the role it played in preserving the social relations of capitalism in Europe. Therefore, the Christian church stressed humility, docility, and acceptance. Ever since the days of slavery in the West Indies, the church had been brought in on condition that it should not incite the African slaves with doctrines of equality before God. In those days, they taught slaves to sing that all things were bright and beautiful, and that the slave master in his castle was to be accepted as God's work, just like the slave living in a miserable hovel and working 20 hours per day under the whip. Similarly, in colonial Africa, churches could be relied upon to preach turning the other cheek in the face of exploitation, and they drove home the message that everything would be right in the next world." And then we start seeing that, throughout, this transatlantic slave system, Christianity was involved in almost every step and providing this moral authority and justification to do horrific things to people. So I'm going to read this, another Paul Keeble quote. He wrote, subsequently, sorry, I can't say the word. Subsequently, slavery in the U.S. became so widely accepted by Christian institutions and so deeply intertwined with the economic interests of all whites that for a long time it was dangerous to challenge. Few white Christians did so. Some abolitionists used Christian texts to decry slavery, but they were countered by other texts sanctioning it, mostly written by ministers who, by one estimate, wrote nearly half of all pro-slavery tracts published in the U.S. Christian denominations, with only a few exceptions, so supported slavery or claimed to be neutral. Christianity blessed slavery at every step of the trade. For example, the present-day Ghana, a small church for baptizing Africans before they were taken onto ships, was situated above Elmina's castle slave pens. Many of the ships had names such as Jesus, Good Ship Jesus, Angel, Grace of God, Christ the Redeemer, Blessed, John Evangelist, sorry, the Lord our Savior and Trinity. In the early days of the slave trade, the Portuguese rebranded every woman on the right arm with a cross. So even as they're doing these horrific, systems of slavery, at the same time they're justifying it and making it, and bringing moral authority to all, colonialism and slavery through Christianity. And then that brings us to pre-Civil War Southern Christianity. So this is after, the United States had, won independence, but this is from this, the late 1700s to up to Civil War and 1860s. So what we saw emerge is this new form of Christianity, Southern Christianity, that basically just became this huge justification for slavery. I'm going to read this quote by Chris Ladd. He said, "What today we call evangelical Christianity is a product of centuries of conditioning in which religious practices were adapted to nurture a slave economy. The callousness and insensitivity of modern white evangelicals was shaped by the economic and cultural priorities that forged their theology over centuries." So we start seeing that, yeah, I mean, there were still churches at the time, you know, that tried to preach against slavery. I mean, like, you know, if you read the Bible and read the lessons, you know, that Jesus taught and many people in the Bible taught, they were all anti-slave, you know, against systems like slavery. They were for equality. So there were still a few churches that tried to preach that, but they were all run out of town in the South, and they had to leave. Some of them were even, you know, lynched. I mean, you just couldn't teach this. Like, you couldn't teach this and actually survive in the South. So instead, this new system of Christianity, this new doctrines emerged, where they removed all the lessons of like social justice, courage, you know, compassion, love, service to others. They removed all that stuff, and then they found passages in the Bible that actually supported, oftentimes very loosely or very indirectly supported slavery. So I'll read this from Chris Ladd, wrote, "Messages which might have questioned the inherent superiority of the white race constrained the authority of property owners, or inspired some interest in the poor or less fortunate could not be taught from a pulpit." So they replaced this with like a big one. They taught, you know, a couple of concepts that this new form of Christianity taught. One was paternalism, that slaveholders were actually doing good things because all these black people were savages and uncivilized, and they couldn't survive on their own. So you know, enslavers were actually, paternal, was a paternalistic, you know, relationship. And they were actually doing good to the enslaved people. And then they taught the enslaved people that, you know, to accept their places and obey their masters. Obey that. There's this Romans 13 is a big one that they use. We see this, you know, during slavery, but also during, you know, Jim Crow, and even today, you know, it's always used to push something really awful, because the phrase basically says whatever the law of the land is, God ordains the leaders who create the, you know, laws that God would want, and if you violate that law, you're going to make God angry. So just follow the laws, even if it means your own enslavement or your own, or your own marginalization. Follow these laws, and you'll be rewarded, you know, in the next, you know, life. And then a big one, this is where we start seeing this connection with blood purity. So this is when we see this connection of, you know, white Christianity, of white race, particularly after the 1700s, when we start, you know, actually defining white race as this legal privilege for white people, you know, in the early 1700s. And it's not just white people, it wasn't just based on skin color, it was based on, racial hierarchy, because a lot of white people who had white skin color, like Jews and Irish, weren't considered white at the time in the 1700s. But anyway, so this idea of white people, this idea of this legal, racial hierarchy, legalized racial hierarchy, was embodied in the idea of white womanhood. And this this draws a lot from this idea of blood purity, that if oftentimes these churches taught that, if black people start intermingling and start mixing with white people, you're going to taint the blood, and then that's going to basically destroy the white race and destroy Western civilization and things like that. So the biggest, it was often taught that the highest, moral, thing that you could do was to protect the white woman's, sexual purity, because that was essentially protecting the purity of the white race. And so that was taught, religiously. That was probably one of the main things that was taught, and that really drove a lot of, after slavery, drove a lot of Jim Crow and segregation and lynching, and even to this day drives a lot of policies as well. So Chris Ladd writes again, "What survived was a perverse emphasis on sexual purity as a sole expression of righteousness, along with a creepy deception with an unquestionable sexual authority of white men." So at the same time, it wasn't, just about white supremacy. It was also about, patriarchy. It was also about, taking away reproductive rights and human rights and civil rights from women. They're this thing that was up on this pedestal, this object for white men. At the same time, white men, were just, it was it's just rampant rape of enslaved Black women, and that was all, okay. Or they would, push these myths that the over sexualized Black woman that, they couldn't resist. But there was a lot of contradictions, oftentimes when you mix white supremacy and patriarchy. But at the same time, though, they didn't see contradictions. They saw, raping Black women as just a thing that happened. It was okay, to do, and then, but protecting white women from rape was, the highest moral imperative that they could do. And I want to read, it's a little bit long, but it's such a great quote. So this is, Frederick Douglass wrote this in The Life of an American Slave. So he wrote this particularly about Southern Christianity. He has this whole intro talks about, I'm not talking about all Christianity. This is just particularly about Southern Christianity during the time of slavery. So he wrote, this Christianity of this land, the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. So wide that to receive the one as good and pure and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of one is of necessity to be an enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceful, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, woman-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason, but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. I look upon it as a climax of all misnomers, of the boldest of all frauds, and the grossest of all libels. Never was there a clearer case of stealing the livery of the court of heaven to serve the devil in. I am filled with utterable loathing when I can contemplate the religious pomp and show, together with the horrible inconsistencies which everywhere surround me. We have men stealers for ministers, women whippers for missionaries, and cradle plunderers for church members. The man who wields the blood-clotted cowskin during the week fills the pulpit on Sunday and claims to be the minister of the meek and lowly Jesus. Blood-clotted cowskin, we're talking about whips, people who whip enslaved people. The man who robs me of my earnings at the end of each week meets me as a class leader on Sunday morning to show me the way of life and the path of salvation. He who sells my sister for purposes of prostitution stands forth as the pious advocate of purity. He who proclaims it a religious duty to read the Bible denies me the right of learning to read the name of God who made me. He who is a religious advocate of a marriage robs whole millions of its sacred influence and leaves them to the ravages of wholesale pollution. The warm defender of the sacredness of the family relation is the same that scatters whole families, sundering husbands and wives, parents and children, sisters and brothers, and leaving the hut vacant and the heart desolate. We see the thief preaching against theft, and adultery against adulterer. Adulterer against adultery. We have men sold to build churches, women sold to support the gospel, and babes sold to purchase Bibles for the poor heathen, all for the glory of God and the good of souls. The slave auctioneer's bell and the churchgoing's bell chime in with each other, and the bitter cries of heartbroken slaves are drowned in the religious shouts of a pious master. Rivals of religion and rivals of the slave trade go hand in hand together. The slave prison and the church stand near each other. The clankering of fetters and the rattling of chains in the prison, and a pious psalm and solemn prayer in the church may be heard at the same time. The dealers in the bodies and souls of men erect or stand in the presence of a pulpit, and they mutually help each other. The dealer gives his blood-stained gold to support the pulpit, and the pulpit in return covers his infernal business with the garb of Christianity. Here we have religion and robbery, the allies of each other, devils dressed in angels' robes, and hell presenting the semblance of paradise. So I know that was kind of long, but it just does such a great job just capturing, how this religion based on, morality is being used to push the most immoral systems. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we can see, that we can still see this today is oftentimes, Christianity, gives people pushing oppressive systems, the moral authority to press them, and that's when we have to be very careful, Yeah, okay. And then, we talked a little bit about, Romans 13 to use to justify white supremacy. I just want to dive a little bit deeper. This is the actual quote. You can read it, but basically it says, whoever therefore resists the power resists the ordinance of God. So it basically says that, God, ordained these leaders, and the leaders created laws that God would want. And if you deny that, you're affronting God. You're resisting the ordinance of God. And we see them use this quite often. And pre-Civil War, Southern churches preached this Bible verse quite often, saying we need to accept slavery because that's the ordinance, and white supremacy because that's the ordinance of God. And then in civil rights era, we see churches use the same verse, to push this idea that civil rights activists were actually going against the laws of God, and they were actually evil. And we still see this today. I mean, even today we see people push this idea that Black Lives Matter and civil rights protests are actually, because they're going against the laws of the land, they're actually going against God. And even Attorney General Jeff Sessions, the first Attorney General of Trump, actually used this verse to kind of to justify separating babies from mothers in immigration detentions. Doing this horrific policy where they separate thousands of children and traumatize these children and put them through such horrible suffering. But and then Jeff Sessions would use this quote to say that this was actually God's will. And then we have post-Civil War, after the Civil War happened, the same churches that were established, during this time period didn't change just because slavery was outlawed. Instead, they actually amped up their services and amped up this fear that, of protecting white women, and that Black, and that, Black, dangerous Black people were now free to like rape and pillage and do all kinds of horrible things. And then we needed violence to control them, violence, or that violent criminal justice system, or lynching, or state violence. I want to read this quote by Paul Keevil. During the post-Civil War era, incidents of racial violence were sometimes spontaneous actions carried out by small groups of people. However, in the tradition of Inquisition, more often lynchings were deliberate, organized, public Christian spectacles lasting days or even weeks. Flyers were printed, newspapers advertised them, and thousands attended, bringing families and friends, picnic, food, cameras, and buying memorabilia and souvenirs. Businesses closed down, and public officials and church leaders were present, and local police kept order. Lynchings, as well as white riots that murdered African Americans and destroyed their homes, houses, and businesses, especially when they thrived, were a form of collective terrorism occurring periodically throughout the U.S. Just like witch burnings and Christian riots against Jews centuries earlier, they served to bond white communities to white Christian supremacy, reminding them as well that what might happen if they protested its norms. For example, like in 1916, Jesse Washington was lynched in Waco, Texas, and over 15,000 people came out, and it was like a big picnic. People were wearing their Sunday's best. They had, lemonade and sandwiches and food, and a lot. And so this is, and you got to imagine, hundreds of children were attending as well, and this was their indoctrination into this thing of white supremacy, and they saw, basically torture this person for hours because he was accused of attacking a white woman, which we know now that most of these accusations were not true. Or many times they were actually consensual relationships, or oftentimes they were just made. Like Ida B. Wells, often wrote about, how they use this idea of protecting, white womanhood to make up these stories to basically attack Black people who were pushing the norms of white supremacy or competing economically or things like that. And just imagine being a child and watching this, and then growing up to this. I mean, this is you're indoctrinating these kids into what it means to protect, white supremacy, and the violence, and the church approved violence, and there'd be church leaders here, that would be, not only participating in these lynchings, but also encouraging them, as a way to protect white womanhood throughout, the South. Oftentimes, they would continue teaching this blood purity that if Black people started started, mingling with white people, and it could destroy the purity of the blood of the white Christianity, and ultimately destroy the race of the white race. And that was, and like you can imagine, like there's times when people were growing up in this, in this indoctrination of violence and white supremacy, and all of a sudden, federal courts were ruling that people, segregation is illegal and it was desegregated in the South. You could just imagine the fear and the violence that followed. Thousands of people were lynched after, during these time periods. It was pretty horrific. Amy Louise Wood, writes, it would be inconceivable that they could inflict pain and torment on the bodies of Black men without imagining the violence as a religious act laden with Christian symbolism and significance. So this, went hand in hand with this idea of churches, preaching to protect the white womanhood. I really like this quote. Jamel Bully wrote, "The God of the white South demanded purity, embodied by the white woman. White Southerners would build the barrier with segregation, but when it was breached, lynching was the way they would mend the fence and affirm their freedom from the moral contamination, represented by Blacks and Black men in particular. That the perceived breach was frequently sexual, defined by the myth of the Black rapist, a demon and a beast who set out to defile the Christian purity of white womanhood. We can't deny that lynching in all of its grotesque brutality was an act of religious significance justified by the Christianity of the day." I think it's very telling that, after slavery, ended, they needed to create, justifications, to continue this racial hierarchy and continue exploiting and Black people. They created this Black criminality myth that all Black people were criminals and rapists. And I think it's telling that they really pushed this idea of a Black rapist because it had been, it spent centuries pushing this idea of protecting white womanhood. So that just, instantly activated, thousands of people that committed just horrific crimes. And then we have the Southern Baptist churches. So Baptist at the time, there was, Northern and Southern Baptist churches, but there was a split between these churches, mainly in 1845, mainly along the issue of slavery. It wasn't that, Northern Church was very, was really anti-slavery or abolitionist. It was more about, they didn't like the system, and they didn't like how that, it mingled and missionaries and all these programs, and just couldn't take it anymore. So they ended up splitting along the lines of slavery. And at the same time, so that allowed the Southern churches to become even more pro-slavery and preach even more of this, protecting white womanhood and white supremacy. And then, after the Civil War, because these churches were so segregated, a lot of these, enslaved, Black people were brought up in these religions as well. They actually had to create their own Black churches. So we saw explosion of Black churches after the Civil War. And that's important to understand. Like people like Dr. King, who got to start in these churches, wasn't allowed to actually preach in the white, Southern church, Baptist churches. He was only allowed to preach in Black churches. So you see that even, a divide happening even more between white Southern Baptist churches and Black Southern Baptist churches after the Civil War. But this continued, this idea of white supremacy and segregation and protecting white womanhood, it really continued, up until the Civil Rights era. One of the biggest, preachers, Baptist preachers at the time and during the Civil Rights era was Pastor W.A. Criswell. Criswell, he taught in this Dallas church, one of the largest congregations of Southern Baptist, churches. He often spoke at, Baptist conventions and was oftentimes like the keynotes or one of the more important speakers. He said this during the 1956 Southern Baptist Convention. Criswell segued into a heated attack on the forces of desegregation. True ministers, he's argued, must passionately resist government-mandated desegregation because it is a denial of all that we believe. He denounced as foolishness and idiocracy that recent ruling of the Supreme Court that was meant to ram integration down the collected throats of the South. Irritated with the carpetbagger supporters of civil rights, he exclaimed, "Let them integrate. Let them sit up there in their dirty shirts and make all their fine speeches, but they are were all a bunch of infidels dying from the neck up. Griswold argued that was that forced desegregation was fundamentally undemocratic and unchristian. He explained that he tried to segregate his daughter from people that are iniquitous and vile and dirty and low. So here again, going you could go, all the way back to 1400 Spain, and with all the common language of like people who weren't white Christian, not just, they could be black Christian, but I mean, and that was still different. People that weren't white Christians were infidels, were unchristian, undemocratic, were vile and dirty, and yeah, this idea of the purity of blood, that white Christians and white were, on top of this racial hierarchy, and the more that they mixed with these people below them, the more it destroyed the white race. So Chris Ladd wrote, so he talked a lot about how this also became this new, this religious liberty argument. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this, but a lot of this, came about in the 1950s and 60s with this idea that because of the First Amendment protected freedom of religion, and they would push it even farther, saying, my religion allows me to segregate, allows me to oppress, tells me that, to oppress others and marginalize others, and to protect a racial hierarchy. So that was my freedom. That was my religious right to segregate and to marginalize Black people. So Chris Ladd wrote, Griswold's bizarre formula as it metastasized and took hold elsewhere could allow white nationalists to continue their campaign as a cultural war long after the battle to protect and segregate institutions had been lost. And, actually in 1995, the Southern Baptist, Church, convention actually apologized. Looking back now, they have actually admitted that, throughout their history, they have supported things like slavery and segregation and white supremacy, and actually did an official apology about all this in 1995. There's still a lot of problems, though, that they're working on. So then we start seeing evangelicals and how they mix with the Southern strategies. Our last section that we talked about was the Southern strategy and how that was used to create this new modern Republican Party along the lines of defending segregation and fighting and opposing, the civil rights movement for Black people. Johnson, wrote after he signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act that we've lost the South for a generation. And after he wrote that, we saw Southern Dixiecrats from the Democratic parties, like Strom Thurmond moved to the Republican parties, and this new party that was basically created as like the white man's, party formed. And really, but I mean, we can, it's easy to oversell this. This was just all about, this is just all this voluntary, movement that really lasted for the next 40 years, from 1950s and 90s. 90s is really when that official movement from, Democrats officially became the party that supported, Black civil rights and things like that, and Republicans became the official party that opposed those kinds of things. That officially came about, during the completed around the 90s, but this move was, assisted by Southern churches. A lot of people write that this couldn't have, they couldn't have convinced so many people to join and to have what we call the political realignment without the help of the churches. Chris Ladd wrote, Southern churches warped by generations of theological evolution necessary to accommodate slavery and segregation were all too willing to offer their political assistance to a white nationalist program. Southern religious institutions would lead a wave of political activism that helped keep white nationalism alive inside an increasingly unfriendly national climate. Spirituality may be personal, but organized religion like race is a social construct. When you've lost the ability to mobilize supporters based on race, religion will serve as a capable proxy. What was lost under the banner of segregation forever has been tenaciously preserved through a continuing culture war. A fight for white nationalism and white cultural supremacy has in some ways been more successful after its transformation into expressly religious rather than merely racist crusade. So what's saying is, like, at first it started out as this transition, this political realignment, was about, race and whether you support or oppose things like integration and Black civil rights. But, not every person, at the time was ready to move to this new, party because of race. So that's where the churches came in, and they kind of coded everything, instead of, being against segregation, it was more of a culture war, to save the soul of the nation and things like that. So we'll talk more about like Pat Buchanan and all these people that kind of switched it from civil rights of marginalized populations to this culture war that is now being raged. It's much easier to think about, this nice coded, word culture war. We're just trying to fight for the soul of the nation instead of saying things like I'm fighting for segregation. And then Chris Lott also wrote, "Forget about Goldwater, Nixon, or Reagan. No one played as much of a role in turning the South red as the leaders of the Southern Baptist Church." So they're integral into this political realignment. And then Paul Keeble, I want to read this last quote before we kind of dive into the to the rising of the official religious right. But he wrote, "White Christian men are still in control, and state-sponsored and sanctioned racial violence continues today in the form of police murder of African Americans and others. The disproportionate incarceration of people of color, lack of access to healthcare, educational and work opportunities, land grabs, residential segregation and gentrification, elimination of communities of color from areas that whites desire to live in. The roots of racial and other forms of exploitation, discrimination, and violence today lie in the centuries of demonization of all those considered other by dominant Christianity." So even though we kind of coded everything and we whitewashed a lot of things, and we're now fighting a cultural war. It's not even about segregation. At the same time, the end results are still the same. White Christian men are still the ones that are creating the policies, that are in charge of these policies, that are still, either, promoting or preserving and perpetuating anti-Black policies and violence against, communities of color. All right, so now I want to kind of dive into, fast forward to the late 70s, early 80s, and the rise of the religious right. And we're going to watch this video and then kind of dive a little bit deeper into the things that the video talks about.
This is the story of the man who helped turn conservative evangelicals into a political force.
I want to talk a little bit about how much our family respects and admires Paul Weyrich.
I want to be like Paul Weyrich when I grow up.
Paul Weyrich has been called the main architect of the religious right. Here he is in 2005.
Those people were not active in politics, and I served as sort of a coach to get them active in the political process.
He also co-founded conservative think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and the Free Congress Foundation. And he managed to galvanize the evangelical vote around a man who wasn't even an evangelical.
God bless America.
Does that feel familiar? Because a similar thing happened in 2016 with the election of President Donald Trump.
2 Corinthians, right? 2 Corinthians 3:17. That's the whole ball game. Is that the one? Is that the one you like? I think that's the one you like because I loved it.
Hey fam, I'm Imayan, and this Sunday, we're going to look at the man behind the evangelical political movement and how it wasn't abortion that created the religious right in the United States. You might have been told that the movement began with Roe v. Wade, but according to Randall Balmer, a religious historian, it actually began with Paul Weyrich.
One of the most cherished myths of the religious right is that this is a movement that got its origins in reaction to the Roe v. Wade decision. It's a great story. It's been repeated many, many times. It is also utter fiction.
It was Weyrich's calculated effort that made the religious right a political force, and his plan took years to complete.
Conservatives were wandering around lost in the liberal wilderness, and then Paul Weyrich came to Washington.
When Weyrich arrived in Washington, D.C. in the late 1960s, he was to the right of more liberal Republicans, which made him a minority within his own party. Back then, the worlds of religion and politics were largely separate. But Weyrich was determined to change that by courting white evangelicals. The group had retreated from politics after the so-called Scopes monkey trial in 1925, which really centered around teaching evolution in schools. Not only did white evangelicals lose, but they also were humiliated in the public eye.
Paul Weyrich, according to his own account, had been trying since the 1964 presidential campaign to get evangelicals active in politics. He tried everything. He said he tried the school prayer issue, he tried the abortion issue, he tried pornography.
In the end, Weyrich landed on school segregation in the South.
Some carried a doll in a miniature coffin, an effigy of federal judge Skelly Wright, who ordered the admission of 5 Negro girls to formerly West grades in New Orleans last week.
And I have to give you a little bit of a backstory first, so please stay with me. In 1970, public schools in 7 states were racially segregated. This was over a decade and a half after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled segregated schools were unconstitutional with its Brown versus Board of Education decision. And Mississippi was one of the states fighting hardest against integration. State leaders claimed that their freedom of choice system allowed Black children to attend white schools. In reality, Black families were subject to intimidation if they tried to enroll. And some white families were so opposed to integration that they abandoned public schools altogether. In Holmes County, Mississippi, there were no white students left in the public school system after just 2 years of desegregation. So where were they all going? Well, between 1966 and 1970, the percentage of private schools in the state rose, and the number of students attending those schools tripled. Most of this growth occurred in Black majority districts.
There were segregation academies, church-sponsored, that were applying for tax-exempt status.
Then in 1969, a group of African-American parents in Holmes County sued the Treasury Department to prevent 3 new segregation academies from getting that tax-exempt status, and they won.
The court ruled that any organization that engages in racial segregation or racial discrimination is not, by definition, a charitable institution.
The following year, President Richard Nixon ordered the IRS to enact new policy denying exemptions to all segregated schools. In 1971, the Green v. Connolly District Court case ruling upheld the new IRS policy, and evangelical leaders didn't like it, which is where Paul Weyrich re-enters our story.
Paul Weyrich finally found the issue that would get the attention of people like Jerry Falwell, who had his own segregation academy in Lynchburg, Virginia, Bob Jones Jr., Bob Jones University, and a broader array of evangelical leaders.
Weyrich and Falwell managed to shift the grounds of the debate. They turned it into a conversation about government interference and religious freedom, instead of what it really was, a defense of racist policies. They used the issue to attack Democratic President and evangelical Jimmy Carter, even though it was Republican President Richard Nixon who came down hard on segregation academies. Bob Jones University lost its tax exemption status a year and a day before Carter was inaugurated. So Weyrich had figured out how to win over evangelical leaders. But to win elections, he still needed an issue to get grassroots evangelical voters to the polls. He realized that defending racial discrimination might not be it. Now this is where the abortion debate comes in. Here's Falwell in 1982.
It began in January of '73 when Supreme Court in Roe versus Wade ruled abortion legal on demand.
But pause. Balmer says evangelical leaders didn't pursue abortion as an issue right away.
Jerry Falwell, by his own admission, did not preach against abortion until February of 1978, more than 5 years after the Roe v. Wade decision of 1973. The key moment for abortion comes in the 1978 midterm elections. Weyrich then resolved that he would go out and elect some improbable people.
Weyrich threw all his effort into getting anti-abortion Republican candidates elected in Minnesota and Iowa.
The final weekend of the campaign, pro-lifers leafleted church parking lots. And 2 days later, in an election with a very low turnout, all 4 Democratic nominees lost to pro-life Republicans.
That's where Weyrich realized abortion was the issue he could use to bring evangelicals to the polls, and maybe even turn them against one of their own, President Jimmy Carter. Before he was elected, Jimmy Carter was a Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher.
And what does the Lord require of thee, but to do justly and to love?
He embodied the idea of progressive evangelicalism and won the presidential election in 1976. In 1979, Falwell created a group called the Moral Majority, but the term was actually coined by Weyrich. The Moral Majority declared war on abortion and homosexuality. Then the group enlisted the help of Francis A. Schaeffer. Schaeffer worked with C. Everett Koop to produce a series of films called Whatever Happened to the Human Race. and toured the country screening them for evangelical audiences. Here's what the films looked like.
The fact that human life is being devaluated is demonstrated by some of the major issues which are being debated by society today. Abortion, infanticide, euthanasia.
And as that series of films begins to travel and circulate across North America, evangelicals become finally attuned to the abortion issue in advance of the 1980 presidential campaign.
Ronald Reagan courted conservative evangelicals, and he won their support despite the fact that he signed the bill making it easier for women to have abortions back when he was the governor of California. Here he is employing explicitly religious language in his acceptance speech.
Can we begin our crusade? Join together in a moment of silent prayer.
Reagan is a man who wasn't even a regular church attendee. Yet during his presidential campaign, he spoke to 10,000 evangelicals at a rally in Dallas, Texas. He talked about the unconstitutional regulatory agenda directed by the IRS against independent schools, aka segregation academies.
He mentions creationism. He also mentions the Internal Revenue Service going after the tax-exempt status of segregation academies. He does not mention abortion in the course of that speech. So even as late as August 1980, the Republican Party was not sure that abortion would work for them as a political issue.
Listen, there are a number of reasons Reagan won the election, but he very well might have tapped into something that Trump and Steve Bannon utilized decades later.
In the 2016 election, 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump, a man who, at least on the face of it, does not seem to be a logical representative for family values. Evangelicals have been able to persuade at least themselves that they are victims of some sort of religious discrimination.
Christianity, it's under siege.
Farmer also says there are parallels between the beginnings of the religious right and the rhetoric that Donald Trump used during his presidential campaign.
The 2016 election allowed the religious right finally to circle back to the founding principles of their movement. And the founding principles, sadly enough, are racism and racial segregation.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And if you want to learn more about evangelicals in the United States, check out the piece that we did on evangelicals of color and the fact that they're totally excluded from the news media's narrative. Join us next Sunday for another awesome video. Bye!
All right, so let's so next couple slides we're going to kind of dive a little bit deeper into the history that they talked about, particularly with this idea of the rise of religious right. And I want to kind of talk about because we sell this one idea that religious right came all organized around Roe versus Wade, and around this idea of like organizing against abortion, but in reality it was much more. Abortion ended up being like the rally, point, but it was about much more than just abortion and family values. It had a lot to do with several different things, that I want to kind of talk about a little bit. And some of the foundations of the religious right really came with two preachers, James W. Fifield and Billy Graham. So starting in the late 30s, 40s, and up into the 60s or so, they really started laying this new idea of relating things like religion to patriotism and to anti-communism, anti-New Deal. Particularly James Fifield, he was big on he created what was called this spiritual mobilization, where he worked with a lot of like big businesses, like oil industries and stuff, who were very anti-New Deal, and really wanted this like neoliberal capitalism, unfettered capitalism. So they worked together to create this national organization, spiritual mobilization, where they advised like tens of thousands of ministers all over the country on how to basically preach about how New Deal progressivism was this preach against this and to kind of relate anti-New Deal rhetoric and capitalistic rhetoric with religion. So I read this one quote by Kevin Cruz: "Spiritual Mobilization, an organization whose mission was to arouse the minister of all denominations in America to check the trends towards pagan statism, which would destroy our basic freedom and spiritual ideas. The organization's credo reflected the common politics of the millionaires in its congregation. Men were creatures of God imbued with inalienable rights and responsibilities, specifically enumerated as the liberty and dignity of the individual, in which freedom of choice of enterprise and property is inherited. Churches, it asserted, had a solemn duty to defend those rights against encroachment of the state." So they were organizing this national movement of churches against things like of New Deal policies and social welfare policies, and kind of pushing this idea that property and free enterprise is mixing that with religion. And then Billy Graham kind of took that and moved it beyond, and kind of took one step to kind of start mixing this anti-communism and patriotism with this particularly during the Cold War. So Billy Graham was this evangelical leader that really tried. I mean, his goal was to influence and consult the nation's leaders, and people like Truman. He started with Truman, and Truman thought, by his own account and his own words, that he was pretty crazy and wanted nothing to do with him. But he found an opening with Eisenhower, who wasn't he wasn't evangelical, but was just looking for ways to kind of unite the country around this, like, Christianity, idea of Christianity, and from there it became this advisor to almost every president from Nixon to Obama. And particularly with Nixon, I mean, that's where he probably had its most effect on policies. With Nixon, he preached this idea that Christianity was also anti-communism, and that it was the religious duty to do everything they could to fight communism. There's this one quote by Jeff Greenfield. He kind of summarizes it really well, this relationship. "Nixon's militant Cold War anti-communism had been perfect match for Graham's Christian versus communism message of the 1950s and 60s. His support for the war in Vietnam was so enthusiastic that on April 15th, 1969, after meeting with missionaries from Vietnam, Graham sent a memo to the White House urging that if peace talks fail in Paris, and Paris failed, Nixon should bomb the dikes that held back floodwaters in the north. This," said Graham, "could overnight destroy the economy of the North Vietnam. It would also have destroyed countless villages, sending as many as a million civilians to their deaths." And there's a lot of he pushed this on numerous occasions, this idea of bombing the dikes, which would have flooded enormous amount of the country, would just caused a horrific famine, and would kill estimates up to 1 million civilians. And this was a religious leader, one of the most powerful religious leaders pushing for this idea, because it was so important to defeat communism that he was willing to sacrifice so many civilians. And then at the same time, even though he was in public life, he was definitely very pro-Jewish Jews, but in private life, I mean, particularly, and there was a lot of recordings during Nixon. They caught him saying a lot of anti-Semitic things. Like this one line, this is word for word. He said, "They're the Jews, the ones putting out the pornographic stuff. The Jewish stranglehold has got to be broken, or the country's going down the drain." So you could see him advising people like Nixon on anti-Semitic policies. So Billy Graham, not the greatest religious leader, but he was huge. I mean, he was one of the more powerful white evangelical leaders of our times. And then, so in the 1950s, at the same time, he starts working with Eisenhower, and that's when they start selling this idea that this country, the United States, was founded on Christianity, which is just simply not true. We were founded as a secular nation. That we didn't guarantee the right to religion, but we also, specifically said, there needs to be a separation of church and state to prevent, to ensure that, right, that everyone has a freedom of religion. Because if we're a Christian nation, that means everyone practicing non-Christian religions are probably going to be marginalized, which is, kind of happening right now. But so from there, that's where, when you ever see the words "under God" on or "in God we trust" on federal buildings and money and all these things, and Pledge of Allegiance, all that was created by Billy Graham, working his way into the White House. So he convinced, Eisenhower to start what they call the first National Prayer Breakfast, which this is where white evangelical leaders come in and basically, advise the president on policies and push and advocate for policies. And this is something that's still happening today. I mean, it's still, there's still a strong connection with evangelical leaders and advocating for policies in our government. But at the same time, they pushed Eisenhower to kind of use religion and Christianity to kind of unite the country, but unite it around this idea that we're a Christian nation, which actually was pretty divisive during that time period. And so Ron Bradley writes, the idea of the United States as a Christian nation does not find its origins with the founding of the United States or the writing of the Constitution. Rather, the notion of America as specifically consecrated by God to be a beacon for liberty was the work of corporate and religious figures opposed to New Deal statism and interference with free enterprise. Really great article. I would recommend reading the whole thing, How Corporate America Invented Christian America to Fight the New Deal. This is all about in the 50s and 60s. Again, these people, James Byfield Graham, using this idea of religion to kind of push these anti-New Deal and anti-communist, policies and rhetoric. And then in the 50s and 60s, we start seeing this explosion of what we call private religious academies, or these white-only schools across the nation. And this was basically because of, 1954, Brown versus Board, we start seeing, federal orders to desegregate all of our schools and start integrating. And then, the South, particularly, well, a lot of the country, but particularly the South, resisted for decades. But they found lots of ways to resist, such as creating these private schools, these religious schools that religious academies that they were able to where white people could, as their public schools were being integrated, they were able to send their kids to these private schools. In many ways, these private schools were able to, bring the public funding with them and finance a lot of these religious schools. And this happened, for several decades. And even to this day, we still have many of these schools, even though they're not legally, legally they can't be white only, but they're mostly white only through a lot of other barriers as well. But these private religious schools, emerged as a way to avoid desegregation. So we see this, so a little bit more on these religious schools, because we're still dealing with this, to this day. So we saw, so this also, these schools, many of these schools were able to create this program, this idea called school choice, and which they had these tuition grants that are later called vouchers, where essentially, we still have this program today. I'm sure this is very familiar to a lot of people, but the idea that, there's a certain amount of funding for each student, per school, public school, and with school choice programs, parents could take that funding and send it to, a charter school or a private school or a religious academy. And this was a big way that there, segregation academies, rose, is because a lot of the funding they were able to capture, despite the fact that these were, going against the law of the land. These were segregation academies. These were academies that were teaching, very anti-Black and anti-Indigenous, culture and education to a lot of people, and we were paying for this with our tax dollars. So, there's a court case in 1976, Ruin versus McCrary, that basically, forced, these schools to start opening up to white students. But, again, there's just so much, barriers to get in there, including financial barriers, that most of these schools even today are primarily white. And so there's, I want to read this one. Randall Balmer writes, many popular textbooks used in Christian schools teach American history in ways that privilege white culture. For example, the books often downplay the displacement of Native Americans or minimize slavery by noting its positive effects, such as introducing slaves to Christianity. And so this is a program, the school choice and voucher programs, ideas still continue today. There's still a huge movement right now to push to have this on a national scale. One of the biggest advocates, unfortunately, is our the director of our education, Betsy DeVos, she successfully pushed Michigan. She advocated for Michigan, the entire state to become a school choice program. After this happened, several years ago, we've been able to analyze. There's been a lot of studies on this, and what they found is not only was there no improvement with educational outcomes with these school choice programs, they also found an increase in segregation and an increase in racial education inequality. So these, traditionally, which isn't a shock because this program was invented to avoid desegregation. So it shouldn't be a shock that even today, the end result is that, they find white middle class students benefiting most from these programs. And not to say there's not, charter schools and things out there that are good, there's probably, some such situations that work out for for everyone and increase in quality, but overall these programs, school choice programs, increase segregation and racial education inequality. And at the same time that these programs push push kids towards these Christian schools and these privately funded Christian schools. And these schools have no accountability. They can pick who they want to accept. They can discriminate. They can make profits. Their curriculum is very anti-gay. It's anti-black. It's anti-science, and it's a very pro-conservative curriculum that oftentimes indoctrinates kids into believing a lot of what the white supremacy culture that we've been talking about for the last couple centuries, and particularly around the religious right. It kind of pushes teaches positively about the religious right. So I want to read this from Gary Myron, a researcher. She wrote that the outcomes we can measure show its Michigan school choice program leading to increased segregation and increased burdens for districts. If we're talking about choice as a market tool and we apply it as a market tool, there's going to be winners and losers. Mostly kids are losing and your public schools are being damaged. So at the same time that all this funding is going to these charter schools, these public schools are becoming more and more defunded. At the same time, these public schools are the only ones that we actually have accountability over, and are actually forced to teach, not to exclude and not discriminate against people, against students. And then there's a big movement right now to start publicly funding these religious schools. In a lot of states, it's illegal to, like Montana, but there was a recent Supreme Court case in June that overturned that. So this Supreme Court case that Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue held that Montana can't prohibit public funding for religious institutions because essentially a parent wanted to send their voucher, take that to a religious institution, or I don't think it was voucher. I think it was some kind of federal state funding program. They wanted to use it for a religious school, and then Colorado, Montana said no, you can't do that. We have state amendments banning public funds for religious institutions, and they took them to court and actually won. And a lot of people are worried about how this is going to be a floodgate for our funding to go to these schools, religious schools with no accountability. So National Coalition for Public Education Rights, the Supreme Court has opened the door for voucher proponents in states to aggressively pursue the diversion of taxpayer dollars to private schools that can pick and choose who they educate and are not accountable to taxpayers. Now more than ever, as our country tries to rectify our history of racial injustice, we need to invest in our public schools that welcome all children and unite our communities, not in private schools that further divide us. But all right, so I want to go back to this rise of religious right after we kind of outline these religious academies, because these religious academies are really at the center of this rise of a religious right, as well as religious leaders like Jerry Falwell. So Jerry Falwell, he was a Southern preacher, who adamantly preached all throughout his career. I mean, he started preaching, I think, when he was early 20s, and he started in the South during Jim Crow, and also during the federal desegregation efforts, and he adamantly preached against desegregation. So he continued the preaching against this, like preserving the sanctity of the white race and keeping the purity of blood and preventing desegregation. So he wrote, "The true Negro does not want integration. He realizes his potential is far better among his own race. Integration will destroy our race eventually." So again, this like blood purity idea. And he was, huge on, preaching against the civil rights movements, the Civil Rights Act. He often preached a lot against Martin Luther King. He actually, worked with J. Edgar Hoover doing, a lot of their COINTELPRO programs where they tried to disseminate all this bad information and propaganda against, activists like Martin Luther King. So he wrote, so he actually worked with, FBI to disseminate a lot of this propaganda and preach a lot of this propaganda, kind of relating Martin Luther King to a communist. So he said, "I question the sincerity and intentions of some civil rights activists such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Mr. James Farmer, and others who are known to have left-wing associations. It's very obvious that the communists, as they do in all parts of the world, are taking advantage of the tense situation in our land, exploiting every incident to bring about violence and bloodshed." But at the same time, he started, in the 60s and 70s as a way to kind of avoid, desegregation, and also as a way to bring a lot of revenue and a lot of new recruits and converts, to his, he started, several different, segregation academies. Lynchburg Christian Academy in 67, Liberty University in 71. That is, up until recently, his son was operating for a while. And then Martin Luther King, I remember reading this, he wrote about these religious leaders in the South. And he wrote, "The most pervasive mistake I had made was in believing that because of our cause was just, we could be sure that the white ministers of the South, once their Christian consciences were challenged, would rise to our aid. I felt that white ministers would take our cause to the white power structure. I ended up, of course, chastened and disillusioned. As our movement unfolded and direct appeals were made to white ministers, most folded their hands and some even took stands against us." So that leads us to the actual rise of the religious right. So again, we still this idea that this all came about, from this huge religious movement, grassroots movement that just, was so appalled by abortion and family values. And, I think that eventually became the religious right, but that wasn't the cause of the, the religious right. The cause was basically, like as that video showed, a lot of it was about, looking, Paul Weyrich and other, political activists and strategists were looking for, a way, looking for, to expand and gain new voting blocks for the Republican Party. And he had been working with the Catholics on creating this idea of this religious right, this religious voting block, and to rally against different, family value issues and abortion and things like that. But, for the most part, in like the early 70s, most evangelicals, were not really interested in this. Actually, many of them, actually supported Roe v. Wade. Southern Baptist, Convention expressed support for laws liberalizing abortion access in '91. Criswell, the guy that we read, the Dallas preacher that preached against segregation, actually supported Roe v. Wade, believed life began as birth, not conception. Most evangelicals did not adopt a firm pro-life stance until the 1980s. And that had a lot to do with this idea that of segregation academies. So all of a sudden, they have so all these new, so it wasn't like Criswell or these people that didn't have schools that created the religious right. It was mainly with religious leaders who had schools and universities, like Bob Jones, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robinson. So all these new leaders that had religious schools, all of a sudden the federal government was looking to take away their tax exemption. And again, this happened during Nixon. Nixon first initiated this. And then Carter wasn't that interested in pushing this. But there was a Supreme Court case, Green versus Conley, that basically said that if you're going to be a segregated school, you can't be a charitable organization. You can't receive tax exemption. So, again, Carter wasn't that interested in enforcing it, but eventually in 1978, federal court basically forced the administration to propose tougher enforcements and start actually enforcing this. And that, that's really what, galvanized and really started, and all of a sudden, all these religious leaders that were, weren't really interested in the religious right were all of a sudden on board. And they were on board to support, any politician that was ready to overturn that ruling, was able to let them continue their tax exemption. And that, that politician was Reagan. Reagan had promised to them that he would continue, the tax exemption, and he would do, work on overturning that, the court case. But at the time, they couldn't just, they couldn't create this like whole movement based on, segregation, racial segregation, or tax exemptions around, segregation academies. They needed better issues, they needed better political strategy to actually rally, their supporters. So, and that's when they came up with this idea of abortion, and later that turned into family values, this umbrella term that included abortion and anti-homosexuality. And so they decided on that, and really based on 1978, they were able to actually organize a lot of people against several candidates around the abortion issue, and that it was so successful they decided to kind of run with that issue. So that all of a sudden, the first time ever, all these a lot of these preachers had never preached about abortion, all of a sudden started preaching. Like Jerry Falwell, first sermon against abortion was in 1978. This was months after Carter's federal enforcement, was law policies, and it was 5 years after Roe versus Wade. So all of a sudden, these preachers start preaching about abortion. And start rallying people, and they got a huge turnout of white evangelicals. People that really weren't political and didn't often vote that much. Through over the last century, were all of a sudden turning out in huge numbers. I remember this is like a quarter of the population are evangelicals, and they start rallying a huge portion of these people, and start rallying them to vote for Reagan. And I know Reagan. There was a lot of reasons why Reagan won. From a recession to energy crisis during Carter's watch, to the rise of Republican Party and racial dog whistles. But a lot of people, claim that this was a huge reason why he won, and he won so big, was because he won the white evangelical vote. And Reagan, who actually passed a lot of pro-life stuff, was not anti-abortion, was not even really a churchgoer. But he talked a mean game. He talked about, he swore, yeah, I'll outlaw abortion, and how, but really, reality, he never really took that serious. Or if he did, nothing actually came. He never actually, initiated anything to outlaw abortion. Even though he put that in his 1980 Republican platform to put an amendment to outlaw abortion. But what he did do was he overturned the Supreme Court ruling that banned tax exemptions for schools, for racial segregation schools. So he did, make good on that request. But unfortunately, the Supreme Court a year later overturned his ban as well. So so these schools, basically, these schools had to eventually let non-white people in order to keep their tax exemption. But there's so many barriers that they're still pretty basically all white schools. But this new movement of white evangelical voters, this is something that from there it just kind of blew up. And for every election since then, on all levels, they've been fighting for a Republican Party. And we still see this today. Even this is the 2016, exit polls. We still see, Trump gets a huge portion of voters, from the evangelical vote. So even though this, these people eventually, I'm not going to argue that people don't really care about, I believe them, they care about abortion and they care about all these things, but their leaders, their preachers, never really mentioned and never really cared about these things until they found it as a useful political tool to protect their revenue and protect their schools, which is a huge source of revenue and a huge source of recruitment. Yeah. And then at the same time that was happening, there was another, movement. It was more of, it's a mixture of a religious white evangelical and also white supremacy and patriarchy movement. It was an anti-feminist, white woman voting bloc that was also occurring at the same exact time around 1980. And that really, what really started this, you could actually watch it. There's a show on this about the person, Phyllis Schlafly, who actually played by Cate Blanchett. And I think it's Hulu or maybe Amazon, I don't know, but it's called Miss America, and it's a whole show about her. She was the one that started this anti-feminist movement, and it really centered around the Equal Rights Amendment. It's this amendment that was introduced in 1971 that was basically going to let in legal inequality between men and women, in divorce, property ownership, employment, things like that. It's supposed to end discrimination against gender. And this was a very popular, bill, or amendment. Both sides, supported it heavily. They were just going through the rounds, getting all the states on board to vote, so it could be an official amendment. And Phyllis Schlafly never had a problem, or at least didn't vocalize a problem for many years about this as they were gaining support. And then all of a sudden, closer to the 1980 elections, she starts, this whole movement called Stop ERA, or Stop Taking Our Privileges. And I think the TV show talks a lot of, kind of implies certain motivations that it was more personal motivations for her. I don't know. Either way, that she all of a sudden became interested in something she wasn't advocating against for many years. But she launched this anti-feminist crusade and basically pushed all this. It was a combination of this like propaganda saying that the Equal Rights Amendment was going to force women to put kids in the horrible government daycares, and it's going to force women to fight wars on the front line. And then, but also she framed this as this like, this idea of like that feminism was actually taking away white women's privileges. The idea that white women, particularly in the South, were on this pedestal. They didn't have to worry about all these horrible things. They were protected from black criminals and rapists. That they had an easy life supposedly, and this was true for a lot of like upper class white women, but was not true for a lot of women. But it was still the idea of it was like. She sold it as like feminism was actually going to take away the privileges that white women had, and was going to, endanger their family values and family and things like that. So they started this whole campaign, GOP, and the Republican Party, aimed at convincing the Republican Party to turn their backs on the ERA. And the Republican Party was all for this for a long time. And then all this is 4 decades. I think it was actually 4 years. Since the beginning, they're definitely for this equal rights. Or I think it was actually 4 decades because Eisenhower actually first talked about this legislation. So eventually they get Reagan to adopt, drop his support for the Equal Rights Amendment in 1980. They get a lot of Republican states to turn their backs on them. Even states that had signed this, had approved this amendment were trying to revoke their amendment, their approval. And at the same time, Reagan, adopts an anti-abortion amendment in the platform that goes really well with their, movement. So Angie Maxwell writes this really great, she wrote this book, Why Southern White Women Vote Against Feminism. It's a really amazing book that explains a lot of why so many white women vote for people that that are like Trump and even Reagan that are very anti women's rights. But eventually they stopped the Equal Rights Amendment from happening, and even to this day, people are still working on it, but the expiration, they had to get so many years to get all the signatures, and that will relapse. So even though they're still getting states on board, a lot of people question the legality, especially since now our Supreme Court is going to be very ultra conservative. I don't think it's going to ever happen. But she writes, Angie Maxwell, Reagan appealed to the same Southern white woman by not overtly opposing women's equality, but by expressing his concern that the ERA would weaken the American family and diminish special protections for women. So I want to read a couple more things that she writes because it really helps explain this new movement of white women, particularly white, Southern white women voting against feminism. or against women's rights. So she wrote about Southern patriarchy. Southern white culture had long been a stranglehold of traditional gender norms. In theory, the ideal Southern white woman was placed on a pedestal, financially supported, removed from the hardships of public life, and protected from dangerous black men she was taught to fear. For poor and working class white women, the pedestal and its protections were more aspirations than real, but the idea was nonetheless powerful and pervasive in the South. Schofie's Stop ERA, which stood for Stop Taking Our Privileges, had capitalized upon this cultural norm, persuading Southern white women to reverse their positions on the ERA. In 1976, 64% of Southern white women supported the ERA, while 16% were opposed. By 1980, however, support had dropped from 42%, while opposition swelled to 44%. So just, take a second. So, in 1976, 64% of Southern white women supported this. By 1980, when the majority of Southern white women opposed it, thanks to this whole campaign. A much more drastic shift than other regions of the country. Reagan also understood the reality of what had happened. He reacted by further promoting traditional gender roles and portraying feminists and women's equality as a threat to the family. In 1982, the ERA fell 3 states short of ratification, even with an extended deadline. In the end, the ERA failed in every Southern state except Texas and Tennessee, which tried to rescind its votes. And then she wrote about Hillary Clinton in 2016. Hillary Clinton crushed Donald Trump among non-white women and even won white women living outside the South. However, among white women in the states of the former Confederacy, Trump, who was endorsed early on by Phyllis Schlafly, bested Clinton by 25 points, 58% to 33%. Courting anti-feminist white women was a critical part of the GOP Southern strategy, one often forgotten today, and that has solidified them into an integral component of a Republican base. The preferences helped explain why feminist candidates struggle in the South and why the gender gap has been misunderstood, why the ERA failed, and why the 2016 election turned out the way it did. So this is, again, she talks about how this helped complete this whole idea of this like political realignment and the Southern strategy and the Republican Party becoming this white man's party. All of this, it was not only about, racial dog whistles and the Southern strategy. It was also about churches, but it was also about this anti-feminist movement that promoted among white Southern women, promoted the idea that patriarchy, white supremacy was a good thing. And then, a decade later, on top of all of this is happening, we have what's called the culture war. I want to read this quote by Margaret Davis. Culture wars are media product designed to sharpen social divides for electoral gains. So culture war is another, coded thing like family values and like other racial, like law and order and all these things. It's coded, not only racism, but it's coded patriarchy. It's coded for a lot of things. But it's basically, it basically summarizes any marginalized group fighting for their rights, whether that's, transsexuals, whether that's, transgender people, or whether that's, gay people or black people or women. It summarizes all this not as their fight for their freedom, but as a fight for the soul of the country. And all of a sudden, all these oppressive, systems are really just engaged in a culture war. And it's so much easier instead of promoting segregation or patriarchy or hate groups. You're just fighting for culture. And this really came about with the collapse of the USSR, because for many decades, the Red Scare, the Republican Party and conservatives and segregationists were all using the Red Scare as this idea that civil rights activists and women's rights activists, they were all communist plots. They were all communists, either being infiltrated and misled by communists, or they were actual communists themselves. Like Martin Luther King was a communist. Women's liberation was a communist plot. So it was all about people still use Red Scare stuff. There's still a lot of people there that you just say socialism or communism, and they'll show you they'll start voting Republican. But for the most part, we lost the serious threat. There was this threat of nuclear war for during the Cold War that was a real threat. So after 1991, we lost that real threat. So that's when people like Pat Buchanan, started, taking the same scares, the same fears from communism, and then kind of relating it to culture war now. We're using dog whistles like family values, traditional marriage, soul of America, take back our culture. All that stuff seems really nice, but the end result of that is they're fighting for segregation. They're fighting for, patriarchy. They're fighting to take, reproductive rights against women. They're fighting for the right to discriminate against, transgender people. So it's just, again, it's just a different form of dog whistles that makes it more socially acceptable and easier to really understand. But I want to start. Pat Buchanan really was started this whole cultural war thing. I mean, it's going on for a while, but he really capitalized it and created, solidified it in the 1992 RNC convention speech. And there he says, there's a religious war going on in our country for the soul of America. It is a cultural war, as critical to the nation we will one day be, as was the Cold War itself. So then you see him kind of mixing this idea that it's not just, it's not just about culture war. He's trying to mix the previous fears of Cold War into this new culture war thing. So Buchanan here sharpens the maps, the contrast he has been working with onto differences in identity. Politics here is not about the distribution of resources, but it's about identity, values, commensurate differences in belief systems. So this is really important. So politics, it's not about distribution of resources. It's not about treating people equally, about making sure everyone has a fair chance. It's about fighting, identity and values and belief systems. On one side are righteous Americans. On the other, a culture of immorality that threatens the proper religious basis of a nation. Notably, the speech makes no different mention of race. Instead, uses code, invoking the LA riots that took place earlier that year. Buchanan sides with the troopers who broke up the riots. So this is what Pat Buchanan actually said about that riots during his speech. They walked up a dark street where the mob had looted and burned every building but one, a convalescent home for the aged. The mob was heading in to ransack and loot the apartments of the terrified old men and women when the troopers arrived, M16s at the ready. The mob threatened and cursed, but the mob retreated. It had met the one thing that could stop it, force, rooted in the justice and backed by courage. And as they took back the streets of LA, block by block, so we must take back our cities, take back our culture, and take back our country. God bless you and God bless America. Unsaid here is that the mob were black and reacting against injustices of beating of a black man, Rodney King, by police. The indications that to take back our culture is to take back our country, is to vanquish the rest of black enemy within. By using code, Buchanan is able to avoid possible charges of racism, positioning the rioters not as racially different, but as culturally different. Their deficient is not genetic, but patriotic. So that's really important. So he just suddenly takes this, the whole, the whole LA riots was all about, black communities, rising up. Yet again, I mean, it was violently and not, against, they're violently rising up against oppression, the police brutality, these systems of oppression that they've been dealing with every day of their lives. This was about a race issue, but Pat Buchanan was able to reframe it that no, it's not about race, it's about culture. It's about being patriotic, with his new definition of patriotism being loving America and not questioning police, So it's all about coding this racism and sexism and homophobia behind this idea of cultural war. And then we see, religious right today, we see, so here's just a couple examples of where the religious right, a lot of these people, so Billy Graham and all these people and Jerry Falwell were some of the founders, and Chris Wall, was a big, advocate of segregation during this time. So we see, Chris Wall's huge Dallas megachurch is actually pastored by Robert Jeffress, who, stated Obama was sent to pave the way for Antichrist, relentlessly preaches against homosexuality and gay marriage, and is a supporter of Donald Trump. Billy Graham's, son Franklin retold the minister he inherited. Not only does he make a huge amount of money off his inherited charity, but he also, constantly makes anti-Muslim rhetoric, constantly preaches against the Black Lives Matter movement, and again, preaches and supports Donald Trump. Jerry Falwell's son, who used to run the Liberty University up until a couple months ago, because he kept on taking because of some a lot of sex scandals and things. And I was gonna say, if you want to learn more about it, Samantha Bee does this really great bit about segment on Jerry Falwell and like his connection with Trump and all this stuff, which a lot of it's, some of it's hearsay. I didn't want to get to, play it, but definitely check it out in your own time if you want to learn more about, why Jerry Falwell is no longer the head of Liberty University. But this guy, constantly preached against Islamophobia. After the 2015 San Bernardino attack, which was perpetrated by a Muslim, he says, always thought that if more good people had concealed carry permits, then we can end those Muslims before they walk in. And of course, he's a strong supporter of Trump, saying he's one of the greatest visionaries of our time. He defends them, that he's least racist, he doesn't have a racist bone in his body. Then he says, this is a tweet from Jerry Falwell, conservatives and Christians need to stop electing nice guys. They might make great Christian leaders, but the U.S. needs street fighters like Donald Trump at every level of government, because the liberal fascist Democrats are playing for keeps and many Republican leaders are a bunch of whips. So again, pushing this neoliberal, anti-New Deal, anti-communism, fascism, kind of like anyone fighting for their rights, are fascist kind of. So these, this is the religious right today, and they're, these are just a handful of religious leaders right now pushing this this agenda. And then I want to talk about religious freedom, which is this new, this argument that basically that if your religion advocates and preaches, if you believe that that certain things that hurt others is okay, then you have a religious freedom to follow that. You have a religious freedom to discriminate, to deny health care, to your workers, to refuse services, to people, to deny, even to refuse to adopt kids to gay parents. So a lot of this, so this is it's a dangerous argument. And it actually, it passed this law, Religious Freedom and Restoration Act in 1993, that basically upheld this, this law. But the Supreme Court ruled it was unconstitutional. Despite that, they keep on referencing this, this law as a, rule on these cases. Like Hobby Lobby didn't want to, the Affordable Care Act was forcing them to actually provide, healthcare and contraceptives, that included contraceptives to their workers, and they refused to do that on grounds of religious liberty. And the SCOTUS, affirmed that, ruled that was, constitutional, citing this Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Baker in Colorado didn't want to bake a cake for a gay couple. Went to the court. Supreme Court finally said that was his religious freedom, citing the RA. And then even more dangerous is the city of Philadelphia. So the city of Philadelphia, gave a contract to Catholic Social Services to help, run their adoption agencies. But they, even though they signed that contract saying that they would not discriminate against gay parents, they did anyways, and they refused to, allow gay parents to adopt children. And so, when the city of Philadelphia found out about that, they tried to terminate a contract, and Catholic Social Services sued. So far, all the courts ruled that, Catholic, social services were in the wrong. You can't just deny, you can't discriminate. So particularly with adoption, that's so messed up. And these kids are, these are one, I'm not even gonna go into it, but it's just such a messed up situation. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court decided to hear this case out, and they picked, November 4th. So we will probably have an ultra-conservative Supreme Court by that time, and I'm sure they're gonna rule that, Catholic Social Services can continue discriminating against gay people. And then 21 states have passed their own individual versions of religious freedom acts. So I'm going to play this video by Anastasia Ocasio-Cortez, talking about just how what religious freedom really means, and how it's often used, not to protect religion, but to allow white evangelicals to discriminate and harm others.
Medical care of people. The only time religious freedom is invoked is in the name of bigotry and discrimination. I'm tired of it. And experiencing this hearing and I'm struggling whether I respond or launch into this question as a legislator or from the perspective of a woman of faith, because I cannot, it's very difficult to sit here and listen to arguments in the long history of this country of using scripture and weaponizing and abusing scripture to justify bigotry. White supremacists have done it. Those who justified slavery did it. Those who fought against integration did it. And we're seeing it today. And sometimes, especially in this body, I feel as though if Christ himself walked through these doors and said what he said thousands of years ago, that we should love our neighbor and our enemy, that we should welcome the stranger, fight for the least of us, that it is easier for a rich man, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into a kingdom of heaven. He would be maligned as a radical and rejected from these doors. And I know, and it is part of my faith, that all people are holy and all people are sacred, unconditionally. And that is what makes faith sometimes, that's what prompts us to transform, because it is unconditional. It's not about that it is up to us to love parts of people. We love all people. There is nothing holy about rejecting medical care of people, no matter who they are, on the grounds of what their identity is. There is nothing holy about turning someone away from a hospital. There's nothing holy about rejecting a child from a family. There's nothing holy about writing discrimination into the law. And I am tired of communities of faith being weaponized and being mischaracterized, because the only time religious freedom is invoked is in the name of bigotry and discrimination. I'm tired of it. My faith commands me to treat Mr. Minton as holy, because he is sacred, because his life is sacred, because you are not to be denied anything that I am entitled to, that we are equal in the eyes of the law, and we are equal in my faith in the eyes of the world. And so I just have to get that out ahead of time, because it is deeply disturbing, not just what is happening here, but what this administration is advancing, is the idea that religion and faith is about exclusion. It is not up to us. It is not up to us to deny medical care. It is up to us to feed the hungry, to clothe the poor, to protect children, and to love all people as ourselves.
All right. And I want to play one more clip. It's a little bit longer. It's a Francisca Forianti. She's part of the AJ Plus, or the news group, and she did a segment. It's a little long, but it's a segment on religion's impact on Trump and the U.S. government. And just give you a heads up, she's pretty corny. Again, I'm not playing this, as a comic relief, but more about the points and that she's making and the information that she's providing.
Let's look at how Christian nationalists have been systematically pushing their conservative beliefs at the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government. See, religious liberty, the freedom of Americans to worship any God and be free from having any religion imposed on them, is enshrined in the Constitution. And yet, while religious liberty cases used to mostly help religious minorities, they're now being reconfigured by the dominant religion as the right to discriminate, especially against the LGBTQ community. They're the kind of state laws that allow adoption centers to discriminate against same-sex couples, or last year's court decision that upheld a Colorado baker's right not to bake a cake for a gay couple. And don't forget the ruling that gave one craft store permission to deny contraceptive health care coverage to its employees. Although that one I kind of get, because there's only so many women you can watch buying yarn to crochet another costume for Meowloween before you're like, girl, you need a baby. Today, religious liberty is basically a way to insulate businesses and people from anti-discrimination laws by claiming that to not discriminate would be against their religious beliefs, which is kind of like telling your partner that not cheating would be the real cheating because you'd be cheating yourself out of Brandon from yoga. See how that makes sense? Most recently, religious liberty was used to pass the so-called Save Chick-fil-A bill in Texas because Texas has nothing if not strange priorities. The governor signed the bill after San Antonio barred the fast food chain from opening a location in its airport. In case you missed it, Chick-fil-A's CEO is a documented homophobe, and the company has donated millions to anti-gay groups that promote things like conversion therapy. The Save Chick-fil-A bill prevents any government entity from taking any steps that would adversely affect a business over the company's so-called religious liberty. Just listen to one gay Texas state representative plead with her colleagues not to pass it.
I'm tired of this. Because this bill is going to pass, let's face it, it's been cloaked in religious freedom. But the genesis and the nexus of this bill is in hatred.
Yeah, the entire premise of this bill is to make sure that the government is forced to embrace a company that advocates for discrimination. But that gets twisted in the absurdity of religious freedom laws captured in the defense of the restaurant by right-wing boy wonder and every 80s teen villain, Charlie Kirk.
Chick-fil-A happens to have a belief in traditional marriage, not anti-anything, but traditional marriage, and somehow that gives the left a license to discriminate against them.
Can you hear how he distorts who the real victim of discrimination is? Also, traditional marriage? How code is that for not gay? Apply that to anything else. Just because I happen to believe in traditional skin color doesn't mean I'm a bigot. I just don't want to watch The New Little Mermaid. I'd rather stay home and rewatch Snow Traditional. Christian nationalism has also infiltrated the executive branch. The Trump administration recently decided to bar health clinics that give or refer people for abortions from receiving any federal funding, even though there were already restrictions in place to keep federal money from funding abortion itself. This move led to Planned Parenthood losing $60 million in funding, even amid a spike in syphilis and gonorrhea in New Hampshire, because Trump likes his swing states itchy. Trump's decision was directly aided by the right-wing Christian group Alliance Defending Freedom, whose former head wrote the book The Homosexual Agenda, exposing the principal threat to religious freedom today, though to be fair, The Homosexual Agenda was the runner-up name for the new season of Queer Eye. Can you believe? Also, remember Jeff Sessions? Small fella, full of hate. As Attorney General, he set up a religious liberty task force to make sure the government interprets religious liberty as broadly as possible. He claimed it was necessary because, quote, one group can actively target religious groups by labeling them hate groups. But if you're claiming religious liberty to denounce people you don't agree with as inferior or sinners whose very existence threatens your own morality, you are a hate group that often instigates hate crimes. Or are we calling them faith-based crimes now? To make sure we take this Handmaid's Tale global, Trump appointed Sam Brownback to be the head of the Office for International Religious Freedom, which monitors religious persecution worldwide. So it was alarming that at his confirmation hearing, Brownback was stumped by this very direct question.
Is there any circumstance under which criminalizing, imprisoning, or executing somebody based on their LGBT status could be deemed acceptable because somebody asserts that they are religiously motivated in doing so?
I don't know what that would be, in what circumstance, but I would continue the policies that have been done in the prior administration in working on these international issues.
I really would expect an unequivocal answer on that.
And I would really expect the Senate not to confirm that guy. But they did, because, ooh, hell is a place on earth. Then there are the courts. Trump has appointed 2 Supreme Court justices and 129 district and appeals court judges. As of April, 90% of Trump's nominees were white and 75% were men, because of course. And he's still got dozens more judicial appointments to make, vacancies he's delighted by.
You know, when I got in, we had over 100 federal judges that weren't appointed. I don't know why Obama left that. It was like the gift from heaven.
No, it was the gift from Mitch McConnell. Heaven is the tattoo inside of his neck fat. Ooh, heaven is a place on Mitch. Trump's Supreme Court Justices Neil Gorsuch and Veer Kavanaugh were huge victories for Christian nationalists that are paying off. The court ruled that Christian-backed crisis pregnancy centers that deliberately mislead women about abortion could freely operate. They allowed the ban on transgender people serving in the military to go into effect, and they'll soon rule on whether LGBTQ people are still protected under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which, if overturned, could mean employees could be fired for their sexuality or gender identity. On the bright side, the vibranium supplements that are keeping Ruth Bader Ginsburg alive are all being administered by non-binary queer Wakandans, so that's rad. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, forever. Also, why are we re-ruling on that was already ruled on? Do we need to end every Supreme Court decision with no takesies, backsies? What about the religious liberty of other religions? Have they been more protected? No. Back in February, a Muslim death row inmate in Alabama was denied having an imam by his side at his upcoming execution, a move he said violated his First Amendment rights. The Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision disagreed and said the execution could proceed without the imam present. Justice Elena Kagan called the decision profoundly wrong, which is SCOTUS speak for Other Trump-appointed judges have records that include upholding a law that forces transvaginal ultrasounds before an abortion and saying gay families were lesser than straight ones. With this hard right turn of the courts, powerful evangelicals are now poised to push new laws at the state level. Meet the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation and their initiative, Project Blitz, which funnels religious bills to state lawmakers all across the country.
There are 20 model bills, and these bills very intentionally are chipping away at religious liberty and religious freedom for all. That's their declared design.
These are cookie-cutter Christian laws, and they run the gamut from making Bible literacy a requirement in public schools to banning gay adoption. But the ones that have been passed in 6 states already are the In God We Trust bills, which mandate that slogan go up in public schools. One Florida lawmaker even sponsored a verbatim version of one of those In God We Trust bills, and she introduced it a week after the Parkland school massacre.
It is not a secret that we have some gun issues that need to be addressed. But the real thing that needs to be addressed are issues of the heart. I ask you to stand with me today in support of this bill that's so simple, just saying put a poster up to remind our children of the foundation of this country.
Sure, it'll be a comforting last thing children see while hiding under their desks. And she probably calls herself pro-life, huh? The scariest part about Christian nationalism is the way that it preys on the fear that Christianity is somehow going away. In fact, according to one study of the 2016 election, quote, voting for Donald Trump was for many Americans a Christian nationalist response to perceived threats to that identity. But the U.S. is still about 70% Christian. And yet, just as with immigration, the perception that Christianity or whiteness as a race are under attack fuels a hate-based agenda. And that has led to real threats and fatal attacks on religious minorities. White supremacist mass shooters have targeted synagogues, a Sikh temple, and, okay, there was an attack on a Christian church, but they were all black. There's a reason we separate church and state in the U.S. America's entire founding happened because a religious minority was persecuted for wearing too many buckles or whatever. The premise of our country isn't rooted in the Bible. It's on the Enlightenment, reason, democracy, religious tolerance, slavery.
All right, we'll end it right there. Unfortunately, I mean, this video I think was shot, several months ago, and unfortunately, Ruth Bader Ginsburg just passed away recently, and Trump is already pushing through his nominee. So when we talk about the impact of this religious right on the courts, we're going to see a whole new level coming in over the next decade. So even more scary at this time. All right, so the next section I want to talk about is the prosperity gospel, because this is something that's been, becoming, bigger and bigger, especially with like the whole movement of televangelists. But it's something that even recently in 2016, it's something that is really blowing up, because this is the religion of our President Trump. And I think for a lot of us, this is the first time we're kind of hearing about this religion. I mean, he really brought this to the forefront, especially with this, like, Trump, is this personal, religious advisor, Paula White, being this millionaire televangelist that preaches prosperity gospel. But we just want to spend a second just so we understand this a little bit. I'll read this first quote from Chris Lehman. Says, "It's not so much that Trump has somehow hoodwinked or bullied the true believing American right into an awkward set of ill-fitting cultural and political postures. It's that a large part of the Protestant world has for decades now been embracing the brash capitalistic gospel of Trumpism. The key bulwark of faith-based Trumpism is a prosperity gospel, a movement rooted in Pentecostal preachings that holds that God directly dispenses divine favor in the capitalist marketplace to the steadfast believers." So this is the idea. It's kind of, it's evangelical, sect, among evangelical Protestants. And it's basically centers around this idea that, about wealth, that it has this thing called tithing, or what they call sowing the seed, where this idea that if you donate money to these churches, which is essentially donating money to God, that God will reward you with prosperity. And the more you give, the more prosperity you'll get back. And this really blew up with the televangelist movement, which is right now a multi-billion-dollar industry where billions of dollars every year are donated to these prosperity gospel preachers, or through different forms of televangelism. It's for different. Not everyone preaches it, but a lot of them preach this idea that the more you sow the seed, the more you give, the more you'll get back, the more prosperity you'll get. And in addition to that, despite the fact that the Bible teaches against rich people. It says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Despite that, this kind of reverses that opinion, and it really, it treats rich people as good and holy, as like God's chosen people. That's why, like Trump, being this supposed billionaire, they look at Trump as God, chose him to be, or that he's holy because he's able to, accumulate so much prosperity. And it's a bigger percentage than we think. In 2006, a Times poll that found 17% of American Christians identify explicitly with the movement. So that's 17. That's a big amount. And then 31% of Christians espouse the idea that if you give money to God, God will bless you with more money. And this is really, like I said, it's really becoming, something that we're going to need to understand, essentially, because Trump, this is, his spiritual advisor, Paula White, is this millionaire televangelist that preaches prosperity gospel and preaches that, to her disciples to donate and sow the seed, and at the same time, she's also, has a huge influence in with Trump and with Trump's administration. And at the same time, preaching, very pro-Trump things, like she says, preaches that just, if Jesus had broken the law, then he would have been sinful and he would not have been our Messiah. This was, her defense to Trump administration separating children at border, demonizing these people as like criminals and then again, she oftentimes accuses the president's opponents of being aligned with evil spirits and using sorcery, which at first you're like, oh, this is just a fringe thing, but since Trump, this is not fringe. This is out in the open. This is these people have our president's ears right now, so it's important that we understand this. All right, so the next slide, I was planning on playing this video, a televangelist video, just a short clip from John Oliver. It does this really great segment just talking about how a lot of these televangelists and gospel preachers, kind of how they get their money from their people, or from their followers. But occasionally I pull all my videos from YouTube, which is a public platform, but at the same time, some of these videos have copyright issues. Occasionally, particularly with I think HBO and certain other platforms, and Comedy Central, they're starting to get up their platforms. So, when I load these videos and I edit them and put them in the YouTube, and then I'll upload them to YouTube so I can embed them in my website. Sometimes I get copyright issues and I get blocked from certain things. So it's, but it's not a huge deal because, well, one, I'm not making money off of it, so there's no like legal issues or anything like that. But two, it just mainly means I can't edit it and use it for, in my presentation, but I can direct people to it. So one thing you can do, this video it's not terribly important, so feel free to skip it if you want. I just there's like a 5-minute segment of this video. It just kind of helps you understand how televangelists kind of steal their money from people, the kind of whole scam that they're playing. So if you're interested in that, definitely check it out. The whole video is fine, but there's a segment, 8 minutes to 13, almost 14 minutes is really what I was planning on playing. So if you'd like to watch this, you can hit pause when I'm done talking. Either type in the name of the segment into YouTube or Google, or if you have presentations, you can cut and paste the YouTube link, or literally just on the People Schools. You should be watching the page. If you're watching this from our website, the page literally right below the video you're watching right now should be a bunch of hyperlinks to the videos, and you could just watch the one that says televangelist. So if you want to go ahead and do that now or skip it, that's fine too. And then just hit pause, watch it, and then come back and just start at the next slide. Yeah, that would be great. Thanks. Example, we'll talk about that. They're selling fake coronas, COVID cures. Jim Baker, Paula White, when everyone got their stimulus check, she did a whole campaign urging people to donate their stimulus checks to her, or else, to get in God's favor and to sow the seed and all this stuff. And at the same time, I mean, they're having influence on a lot of these people that honestly don't have another place to turn, that are in bad situations, and they're preying on these people. And at the same time, they're doing this tax exempt with the approval of the U.S. government right now. And at the same time that all this is happening during COVID. We're seeing just how dangerous a lot of these evangelical organizations are when we have to pass public health measures and we have to do stay-at-home orders. I want to read this. Alex Woodland writes, despite the climbing death toll, many U.S. church leaders throughout the Bible Belt have not only continued to hold services but have urged worshipers to continue paying tips, including recent stimulus checks, to support their mission. You see a lot of evangelicals when states were closing down, early in the, when COVID hit in spring, they started preaching that this is a phantom plague or that God will protect you. And they encourage their people to continue going into these, large congregations, that, against the, orders, stay-at-home orders. They continued to hold many congregations, huge, congregations and mega churches, despite a lot of things like Florida. Florida, was, super late at imposing stay-at-home orders. Governor DeSantis, when he finally did, evangelicals worked, advocated with them to allow him to actually exclude churches. So even though the whole state was shutting down, churches were still, remaining open, and that was a major source of COVID contamination. And were these churches. At the same time, a lot of people are playing politics off of this. Like Mitch McConnell says that religious people should not be singled out for disfavored treatment. That was, his response to the idea of churches, temporarily closing down or just moving their services to online, which, that online, the problem is you can still teach, you can still preach to everyone online, but it's harder to get tips and donations, so that's why there's been a major push. And even though there's been surveys that 90% of the congregations in this country are closed down and are encouraging worship at home and all these new forms of worship, there's still 20% of parishioners are saying they're still being encouraged by their pastors to come in and attend services, and 17% are continuing. Even now, we're still having it's still a major issue in the Bible Belt. They're still having these large congregations in these closed indoor congregations, and at the same time we're seeing all these prosperity gospel leaders trying to sell COVID cures, fake COVID cures, trying to encourage them to people to get their stimulus check because they'll get even bigger stimulus checks from God, and it's just it's a scary thing that we all need to be aware of right now. The last thing I want to leave on this this is the last slide of the sections. I just want to leave with this quote because I just found this quote to be so powerful. It says, "I can't believe I grew up thinking using God's name in vain was saying, 'Oh my God,' and not using God to manipulate people and advance your own personal agenda." And I just think if you got one quote that would summarize the religious right, it would just be this quote. They sell this idea, all these ideas of what it really means to be Christian, family values, not using God's name in vain, all the while they're using God to manipulate people and to push agendas that are causing a lot of harm. So I think this is a great way to end the section with this quote.